Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy and Mike. Hello, everyone, and welcome back.
How you doing, Mike?
How you doing, Tommy? I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Thanks for asking. It's another early episode. We are up a little bit early today. We are doing a recorded episode, so this is recorded episode. Tommy and I are doing some traveling at this time, so we won't be able to make these meetings or these podcast calls. So for that being said, this is going to be maybe a little bit shorter of a topic around some of our main items. We don't really have any news items for this one. We're just going to jump into our main topic today. How do you feel about that one, Tommy?
I know it. I love it. I think it's hard to do the news when it's a podcast. Just like how much television's changing too, where
It's recorded.
Really, yeah, especially when it's recorded. Yeah. So
sure.
you love to do everything, but dude, this is a topic that I'm really happy with. Some of the latest topics that we've done. We're diving into some heavy things.
I think a couple episodes ago, we had discussed this idea of how do you transition data from one person to another? And so that's kind of where the topic came out of. The comic is really spun out of what is a data contract, or unpacking what data contracts mean in lieu of items inside Fabric. And so we have a number of control mechanisms that are inside Fabric for security, but security just means you can kind of read it or not, or interact with it or not. That's not necessarily a data contract. And so Tommy, you said something, I believe it was in an earlier podcast episode, you're talking about how much you're loving one-lake catalogs, which is a form of what I think we'll unpack here in a bit around. That's part of what a data cataloging is, part of a data contract. What data is in this source, what data is, what's the column information in it, what is the column name. There is rules around how this data should be used or be built. So that way, when a consumer consumes the data, as they have confidence that the data is consistent every time they look at it. So that being said, go ahead, Tommy.
No, I was going to say, this is, if you want to hear, this is literally from our agile development that we talked about, and trying to apply things that usually don't fit in the business intelligence world or in the world that we worked in, and trying to apply that to what we do today.
So let's unpack. So I kind of want to just go through maybe for people who haven't heard what data contract is. We think we've thrown around this term a couple times on the podcast, and I would just like to kind of unpack what it means. And so for me, my definition around this is a data contract is a written or documented, maybe not written per se, but like a documented agreement around what data I'm giving you. And it comes with things beyond just this is the columns I will give you, and this is the kind of data that's in there. And when I think about, specifying things in SQL, data contracts remind me of the SQL create table phase, right? This is the table. These are the columns I'm going to tell you. This is a column and it's a varchar 90, right? This is a varchar 50, right? So this is a Boolean on this column. This is a string on this varchar on that one, or whatever. There's data types that are associated with columns. And so sometimes you have, I think about this table creation experience in SQL, because some columns get, a whole long line of text, but what happens if the text is longer than the data you're bringing it to in the column? So sometimes you have a feature where you truncate data, where the text field gets too long, you can't store the whole thing, and you just kind of abbreviate it and put what's left into the cell in SQL. So I think that's kind of the expectation here. In this article that I'm going to share in the description, so this will be in the description of the video, Atlan, I think is how you say them, is got a really good article around what is a data contract, but they talk a little bit more about than just the data contract. It talks about what it is, why they're important, and then it says what is inside the data contract: the schema, the semantics, a service level agreement, which is something I actually really like to talk about when I talk about contracts. That's one of the main things I think about when I how often is the data refreshed, and what happens when it's wrong? Who's maintained? What's the owner of the data? And then they also talk about something here around the metadata of that source of information. What does the governance look like? And so I think let me just pause right there. I'm seeing a lot of things, Tommy. What's your thought on these topics? What's your impression of the data contract?
So, and especially you may read this, and it really, I feel like this is what I'll call the classic data contract, because really the bulk of this is very technical in terms of implementation and agreement to it. Again, you're talking about the metadata. We're talking about how how large a column can be or how many values can be in it. What are the outliers that are allowed, right? And those are all a lot of things that from the business side is fine, but from a per column point of view, this is much more on the developer on the technical side. It's really not until the very end you actually get into, I think, more of the meat of the thing, that what people really care about, especially if you're going to put an agreement with the business when it comes to, again, those SLAs and the data governance. But it's very, very metadata focused in the original idea of a data contract.
I disagree with your statement there. I don't think it's technical. You said it's very technical. I don't think it is. I would probably address, like, if I had to put like a hierarchy of needs on these things, like technical is probably part of it. But I think really the important thing that I think about data contracts, I'm more interested in like the service level agreements,
So
the security of it, and then just having like some. I mean, you could do some very vanilla things in a data contract between one team and another, or one person and another, right? You're kind of inadvertently already making data contracts. Every time you publish something to PowerPI.com, you're kind of in some way making your own data contract. It may not be documented, but the tool allows for aspects of a data contract to exist.
right.
But you don't
No,
even
so,
you
yeah.
don't even know you're doing it, right?
No, so I agree with you in terms of what we focus on. I'm saying the Atlan article and all the research. If you were to say define a data contract, it does go heavy usually into the schema metadata. But no, I'm with you in terms of the data contracts that I focus on, or what I try to focus on more is the SLA is going to be that on the governance side of things.
I mean, yes, this article. I mean, I think there's schema as part of the solution here. Like, it's part of the idea. The semantics of what they're talking. Like, so yes, those are part of the solution. But like, I don't think it makes it technical. Like, I don't agree with that statement around that it's very technical, and this article is like really pushing towards technical. I think it's just something that they're putting in here or applying with this. So I don't really understand that part of your comment, but I mean, I think the schema is valid. I think the schema is important to put on top of whatever data contract you're applying. So that does make sense to me. So I don't know. We'll see where this conversation goes, but I want to kind of move forward then. So, talking about these different aspects. So starting with like schema, semantics, service level agreement, and then metadata. The schema is just what columns, how many columns we have, what are the names of said columns, and what's the min-max length of them, right? Something like that. So that could be very simple. When you get into a semantic model, when you build a semantic model, you already define a schema already exists for everything. It's all there. So that's not a problem. I don't see there's any issue with, the semantic model has a definition, it's a description. That's a place where you can add that. You could also think about it upstream inside lakehouses as well. Lakehouses also have schemas for all the tables as well. So, there's two main areas that I'm thinking about for where schemas exist, right? And again, you're talking about how technical it is, and I don't agree necessarily, because in order to make a table in the lakehouse, the semantic model has to read the schema and bring it in and just use it. So, like, those things, I think it just comes along with the pattern.
So go ahead.
I was going to give you a question with this one, Tommy. Like, so schema to me is just very easy to understand. These are the names of the columns. This is the kind of data that's in them, and it's defined somewhere. Easy. The other things I want to talk about is like semantics. So semantics is a little bit differently. Like, these are more, I think, business level rules. When you provide definitions to individual columns, defining what they mean. And so that's more of where I want to kind of unpack, like the semantics of the schema or the data contract. What do you think about those points?
So this is where it gets interesting, especially that you brought up the one lake catalog to me as well. And I think this has always been one of the biggest hurdles for a lot of people working in a tool like Power BI, because of the ease of creation, the ease of use, is the fact that it is quick to change. It's very easy to update a column compared to, I think, a lot of legacy systems. But the problem is the ownership of this when it terms of like, I'm creating the model, I'm creating the tables for, even just for the business and maybe their data. But I think a lot of times we run in trouble of, okay, how do we actually define this? What are the allowed values? And there's a problem here because I think the biggest struggle that a lot of BI teams have is not the report building, it's who owns what, and not just who owns the data.
That's not
But
semantics, though.
okay,
That's something different. Semantics is not who owns anything. That's metadata. You're jumping ahead. So like when we're talking about semantics right now, like just focus on the semantics part of it. So like that's the business rules. Like this column cannot be null. This key is identified in the dim user table. Like that's what I'm. So I think you're jumping ahead too far. Like the semantics is like defining the business rules of what you expect about the data.
So give me your definition.
So semantics, like it's the business entity. So if you read the article, it's talking about semantics are about capturing the rules of each business domain, right? So I have, sales information, right? This is Tommy, what you've talked about before in prior options, right? What is a definition of a customer? How do we define it? Is a customer someone who purchases something from us? Is it someone who purchases something from us in the last 6 months? Like 1 year? Like what is that definition? So the semantics of that, when we have a table of data and we say customer column or customer table, we're defining this information. When we say transaction, what does that mean? There's a language here that all teams must adhere to, and you may not agree with like the standard definition. You may make up your own definition for your department or whatever you need to report on. Well, you can't use the word transaction in that. You need to think of something else, like microtransaction or some other term that defines what you're using. But like those general terms, and I think the semantics is actually where we need a lot of effort. And I don't think Fabric does a good job defining the semantics of things. This is where you use things like in Python notebooks, you would use great expectations to rip through a bunch of data and say, hey, this customer key column cannot be null. And you can test that. It's a test that every time the data loads,
that is tough.
It's on. It's like it's there. It's that it has passed the test. So to me, this is a lot of those things where deviation from normal is another example, right? Hey, we expect this column to have whatever. It's a percentage, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that percentage should never be more than 100% if you add up all these items. Or if you group by this and add it up, it should never equal more than 100%. Those kind of things are tests you apply to the data. And so this is an area where I think a lot of organizations don't have this set up in their environment, but they want it. I'm doing a lot of project work right now, helping customers figure out where to put data quality or business conditions that require data to be of a certain quality. Does that make sense?
No, that's perfect. I'm going to table my tangent because
I think you were talking ahead of where we were.
Honestly, though, the tangent being, and again, I'm going to mention it. I want to see if you highly disagree that it's a very chicken or the egg. All those rules and definitions have to come from someone. But no, I completely
do.
Right.
But do we document it? Do you actually like how many data sets do you build that has a test that says I'm going to load the customer table and I'm going to confirm on every data load that we pass this test? You have to build all that. That's all custom. That's all custom stuff you build. It's not like building the tool.
And like I said, so again, my argument of the chicken and the egg is who's making those rules and who's agreeing to it. But I agree that we never had a process in Power BI. There's been some attempts at it in terms of a integrated kind of tooling system to do that, especially with a semantic model.
Yes,
we've never had that.
There's other tools that do this kind of like there are tools that you can go buy. Like when you use Databricks, Databricks has this thing called assertions on a table. And so Databricks has a feature that when you load data in on a row by row detail, do you assert that this value is of a certain type or data set type? And what you can do is you can flag records and say, basically add a new column that says this row of data was discovered to not adhere to a data rule or policy. You can flag it. And when you flag it, you can come back and you can either filter that information out and move forward. You could fail the job and say, don't process the data. There's a problem. You need to fix something. There's different ways or methods on how you'd handle this. But your comment around who should decide this, it's a collective decision, right? It's a decision on the person making the data engineering to build the table and the person consuming the data. Typically, I think the person consuming the data has more vested interest in making sure those rules are right. Does that make sense?
No, you would think that they would have the bulk of the interest there.
Well, if it doesn't work, the person consuming the data comes back to the person who made the data and say, it don't work. And then the expectation is if it's not running correctly, if you don't state these, this is another thing. Let me go another example here. working with my kids, kid example here, right? If I don't like, so let's say someone's acting up, they're being loud, they're being obnoxious or whatever. If I just walk into a room and just immediately give out a punishment on one of my kids, they're really bent out of shape and are like, that's not fair. I didn't know. What was the expectation? So they get bent out of shape and they get angry at me if I just come in and discipline without any kind of prior expectations as to what's going on.
Sure.
So when I drive to someone's house and we have our kids, we're going there and I'm like, okay, look, before we get out of the car, here's my expectations on some behavior I expect you guys to do before I go into the house. It's my, family contract or my behavioral contract with my kids. Like, we want you to be respectful. We want you to be kind. Don't eat with your mouth full. Don't talk with your mouth, like just things that they do. And you're like, I don't want you to do these things. This is what I want you to do. If you don't have that conversation, there's no responsibility for anyone. And then when you come in and say, look, you're being a ding dong, like, don't do that. Now I say, remember in the car when I said the thing and we said, we're going to not do this. And you did it anyways. To me, this is what semantics is. Semantics is the same thing for like two business groups to say, I'm expecting it to be this way. You need to get better at describing what your expectations are. Cause I don't think and it's very difficult for people to do this.
So
it's not done well.
And I like the kid analogy, and I can't tell you how many times I've told my own stakeholders, you ding dong, for something that they've been working on as well.
Right.
It does. There's a wrench here though, because in principle, you're 1,000% correct. But I'm going to throw a wrench in here because, especially when you're introducing this idea for the first time, these concepts, this is much more than simply saying, hey, don't hit your sister, because we need those requirements, like, and not just requirements, but it's like, okay, what are the outliers? What are the things that are the constraints? A lot of teams in business, especially the people you're talking to when we're building, they may not be aware of all the, in a sense, junk or things that are unnecessary. They just know what their number is because they've done it a certain way. So there is a conversation here that needs to happen, that they also have to put work in. And a lot of times you find that a lot of leaders, they unless there's someone in operations who's going to represent them, I want to report, why am I the one in a sense doing the work? Yes, it's completely essential because, again, to your point, if we run into something that's not allowed, if we run into something that we need to alert, again, we can't just write that on the fly, but we need to have those constraints and we need to have those, in a sense, those guidelines. But then if I hand someone like, okay, here's everything, we found 25 values when you said that it's either prospect or sale. Are we discarding the others? And that's just one situation where they go, whoa, they're not aware of all these things. So that's what I'm trying to say is the big wrench here is this all has to be established before we even get into nearly anything else. And it's a hard conversation to have, again, especially when you're not dealing with, again, a data representative.
Let me give you another example that I've discovered, or I agree with your point, Tommy. I think you're right onto something here with the whole idea of like, look, the business doesn't necessarily know all the rules that they need. So, couple things. You don't know there's a problem until there's a problem, right? So I'll give you the data. So let me play out a scenario here. I'm the business. I'm complaining about, I don't have data. I can't get data. I need data. Give me data. Give me data. IT's like, fine, I'll give you data. Here, I'm going to make a lake house. I'm going to make a semantic model. Here's your data. And the business goes, oh, great. I now have access to the data. And then the business says, wait a minute. This doesn't make sense. Like, I'm trying to do the join between these two tables and like, it's not matching. Or where did this value come from? I don't understand where that came from. Like, and so then the business comes back and says, wait a minute, something doesn't look right. And then there's like this, they are asking for the data without any expectations towards the data, or not really even understanding how the data is like related to each other, like different tables and things like that sometimes. And again, not every business unit is the same. Some business units are great and they have a great understanding of like how their data is woven together and like they understand it and they see it. But when you abstract the tables of data so far away from the business, sometimes the business doesn't understand how dirty the data is. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you have to start small. You start with very few rules initially, and then as you discover them, or as you discover the problems, you're going to have to like update these contracts and kind of modernize them a bit and get both teams to agree upon this, right? A common example I find is let's call it Salesforce. Salesforce is pulling data out. Data engineering sucks out the tables. Salesforce has lots of mini tables in them. You do the joins the way that Salesforce joins the data together. You now have a final user table or customer table. And when the business gets it, they're like, well, this is not right. Why is the data in this column? Or the data on this row is wrong. Well, whose problem is it? It's not data engineering's fault. And this is where I think, Tommy, you and I get stuck in the middle a lot because we're data engineering and we get like the blowback of like, well, this is wrong. Like, no, time out. My data coming to you is exactly as it came from Salesforce. So business, we're just giving you what's already in there. Actually, it's you business making the problem because you wrote the wrong data into the column. What you need to go do is go fix your data in Salesforce, and that way it comes through the system correctly. But what we find a lot of times is the business comes back to data engineering and says, fix it. And so data engineering builds additional business logic or rules or filtering to fix an existing problem that should have been fixed in the source system.
But here's so what I'm getting hung up on is because I literally had this type of project or situation almost a year ago
I know
on a
this
migration.
is common.
But here's the thing. So I like the idea of we're going to build as we go. But here's the thing: we can't continue once we find something if we're building as we go until we get the okay or the updated. Here's the definition. Okay, we finally found this is what's allowed.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not going to only usually, especially with new data, a new contract, that doesn't just happen I found one column out of everything, right? So here's the thing.
Sure.
So here's the thing. If I'm tasked with building a model or a report, and we're not just talking in your standard run of the mill quick report. This is something that is going to be relied on for a department. Well, we have to have that ample time because that is going to cause more time to actually get a result. People are coming to me as the report guy, the Power BI guy, the conception of that. It's like, okay, here's my table. We get the data in whatever legacy system or Excel file, and I just get it. And every time I look on Monday, it's updated. Now you're coming to me every 3 days, and I have to do all this more discovery on what these things are I've never seen before, or I have no idea what this definition is. This is taking more work than the Excel file. And this is a common situation where if you come as you go, when you're building as you go, and you're like, oh, I found a hurdle. I need to get the confirmation, or I need to get the rules from the business. We keep doing that. That just delays any fruit, any results. No, I had a project where the stakeholders, they were getting pretty frustrated on why it was taking so long, but we finally had a conversation. Look, I've been working with a team and we don't have a definition. So we can't create any number because no one knows what the rules are. So before we can move forward, we're not going to build a report that's wrong numbers. And that realization that all these different kind of, things under the rock, so to speak, that were not discovered are usually what we are the ones that are taking on.
Yes, I mean, I agree with your point there, but I guess I think it's unreasonable to not do any So I'm on two ends of the spectrum here, right? On one end of the spectrum is like, do we take on any project? Like, do we not do any project? Like, how do I say this one? Do we not start any project until all the rules are defined? The answer is no, we don't do that. Do we start every project with no rules? The answer is also no. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. Like, you can't go one way all to the other end. And as your team matures over time, like, hopefully they'll be like, oh, in my last projects or my last items, like, I was able to figure out a little bit of, oh yes, we've done this table work before. We know that this column needs to be filled out for the relationships to work, or we know there's going to be some bad data. We're going to filter it out. I'm just going to tell someone the bad data exists, right? So these are things that you've learned from like experience with working with your data in your company. The other point of this I'm trying to maybe make here as well is the data culture is very important in this experience.
Yes.
So one thing that was going through my mind here is like, what happens when you find there's a problem in data? Like my example I just gave earlier, right? The business team finds that there's a problem with the data, and you have to trace it all the way back to the Salesforce system.
Mhm.
Who's really responsible to fix it in the Salesforce system? Well, there's a lot of potential pointing of fingers in that situation, and you need someone like the CTO or someone at the higher level that can say, look, let me hear your arguments. Let me figure out what's going on. Okay, let's identify in our process who's the actual part in the failure here. Is it a data engineering loading problem? Is it a source system issue? Where's the issue in the pipeline? Let's identify where that is and say, okay, now we're going to go, okay, this team, you had the data quality problem. It's in your area. Go fix it. And give them a timeline or a deadline to go in and fix these data. Because to your point, Tommy, right? We want to build all the net new things, but there is an amount of supporting of old stuff or existing things that we have to balance as well. So I also see the new teams to the data world seem to focus on like only building net new things, but not really providing enough time or support to maintain existing things. So it has to be a balance. You can't just keep running forward as fast as you can. Leadership would always love you to build only new things moving forward, but then that removes the support for all the existing stuff that falls over, and then you can't use it. It's irrelevant.
A lot of, again, with depending on the data culture, they just have the perception that we're very good at bar charts, not all these other things too. So, and this is a perfect point, I think, why bringing data culture into this now, right? Because when this has to be part of the expectations, and I think to me, when we are really talking about the data contract, oh my gosh, if we just say, yeah, we'll build a model, we'll do some discovery, and we'll ask if any questions, you're asking for failure. You're asking for frustration, for people to not be happy with the results because it's going to take too long. There's going to be too many questions. If we're going in and with again, some model that we know it's going to be reused, something that has that path to certified, this has to be part of, honestly, when we're talking about a data contract, something that is signed, confirmed, and read by all parties involved before we start. Yeah. You don't want to make it bigger than it is, because for every single model, right? Where it's like,
Well, so this is, again, I agree. I like what you're going with this time, because I'll go back to like, is it certified or is it not? Mm-hmm. Right. So like, certified things I think require a little bit more rigor, right? So I do think on certified data sets, you'd have for sure at least a data contract written out, or at least something documented on a SharePoint site, or at least write down some very simple things.
Yeah.
And so going back to like the documented business rules around the semantics, there's nothing in Power BI today that defines where we would store the semantics of that model. There is an area. So when we move on to the next section of the article, it talks about what else is in a data contract: service level agreements, the SLA. That I think would be very useful to put that in the description of the model itself. So, this is one thing we say, let's add descriptions to things. Well, in the description here on the article, it's talking about, right, what's the latest time the data is expected to be in the product, right? So data should be loaded by 9 a.m. Central Standard Time or Eastern Time Zone, right? So, and if this doesn't work, set up, at least notify in the description, like, automatic notifications have been set up. If this thing fails, the data team will be aware of this and, write the conditions. An email will be sent out to the users of this data set, or a note will be made on the SharePoint page when the system's down and we're fixing and investigating it. So like the SLA of things, I think that's really a big, it's a trust gathering element.
Oh, huge.
Right. What happened, there's other, they call things like metrics here. I've never really heard of these terms before, but they make sense to me. They talk about mean time between failures, MTBF. And then they say mean time to recovery. Like when it does fail, what's the average time it takes to recover the data or get the data back in there? Like, those could be metrics that you put on top of this for like when you do ticketing or ticketing systems. If something fails, you can figure out when it failed and how long it took you to resolve and complete the issue. But, at the end of the day, right, I think the service level agreement is like something that the data team, or if the person building the table, they should take a swing at that first and say, here's what I can commit to based on the technical pieces on the back end, right? If the data doesn't come in until 5 a.m, well, it takes us 2 hours to load it. it's going to be a minimum of 7 a.m. minimum, because it's going to, and then, give yourself some padding there. So by 8 a.m. we could have the data there, right? Is that going to meet the business needs? And if the business says, no, we need it earlier, then you've got to figure out a different solution on how to get the data there faster. So I think there's things that's a conversation that should be happening.
And again, we were very limited this when we were just in the world of Power BI and semantic models, because it was read only. It was hard to kind of go through the metadata of that and add that, right? So a lot of times we could do like the refresh schedule for all the things, but I think what we're really diving into here when it comes to the column quality, the business quality of that, like we were more or less at the mercy of the data coming in. We didn't have the data engineering, the semantic model. If something broke, in a Power Query, or something broke in a data flow, before we asked anyone, we're immediately going to the Power Queries, like, was it the database? Did someone input something wrong? And that was much tougher because we didn't kind of control that process. But now we're, and I don't know if you want to table this or move into this now, but this is going to change drastically, I think, with having Fabric available to us.
Well, I was just in a conference, and at the conference, I was in the Power BI Netherlands group, and they're doing a really good conference. I was in one of the sessions, and they were talking about things, and one of the common notes was Microsoft was on the stage presenting a new feature, and everyone was like, okay, interesting. They're unpacking the feature, they're looking at it going, okay, this is interesting. And a question came out from the audience is like, is this Fabric only? And the number of organizations in that region that didn't have Fabric yet, or their central team did not allow Fabric to turn on, was quite large, honestly. So there's a lot of teams that were still like trying to figure out if Fabric is a play for us. So, when we talk about pure Power BI and what Fabric is doing, I think you have a lot more opportunity to build more data. So you're adding more data engineering. You're bringing all the tools that came from other worlds, like the data platform in in Azure, over to Fabric. Event hubs, lake houses, storage tables. There's a lot more surface area now. And what's happening, I believe, is the business is getting more access or more direct access when Fabric is turned on. So there's a couple of hurdles I see here. One, you've just got to be able to turn on Fabric to begin with. If it's not turned on, then you're out of luck.
Yeah, and again, we're seeing that even too with people who listen to podcasts. We're getting there, Mike. We're getting there. We're getting there for everyone to turn it on. But so I guess for a lot of people then still in the Power BI world, if this is still something that you think is going to have a slower adoption, I guess what are some of the kind of, I guess, approaches that we'd want to do? Because I really think the data contracts conversation is one that, at least on my end, those only discussions have really been in the data engineering world. And I would say closer to the back end in terms of something being established, like part of any process. It was something new and exciting when we brought it to the business, the reporting into the business, but it was always harder to do in terms of like for every approach. So if Fabric is not going to be the way or the quick adoption, we're talking just Power BI, then what are some of the approaches then?
Well, I guess what I'm looking at here, when I look at the article, I think things like metadata or the data governance portion, that seems to be pretty well handled by like the security of the resource group, right? So I have the workspace, I have admins, contributors, members, and viewers, right? So that's some level of data control of who can even see the data to begin with. You have another layer of that metadata governance by adding row level security or object level security. Which tables can you not see? Which rows of data can you see or not see? So I think, to me, like I think a lot of like the metadata, the data governance portion is already kind of really built into the tool. So yes, maybe you're talking about those requirements. Those are requirements that you're probably gathering at the beginning of your semantic model build and using them to generate the actual semantic model. When I look at the service level agreement, that's information that I feel like should be captured at the description of the semantic model. Like this is an area where we could put it right next to the model. When I start talking about semantics, and this is where I'm talking about, like these are like the business rules, like the data tests of the data. To me, these are not really built into the tool yet. right? I have to build a separate process that does tests on columns or tests on loading of data to make sure the net new data I'm bringing in adheres to a quality standard. And then, another thing here I want to kind of point out here is Databricks already has this. Databricks has this thing called table monitoring. So a table monitoring, what it does is every time you load data, it monitors a table and provides all the statistics of that table. How many records were loaded? What's the distribution of data in each of these columns? So to me, that's really interesting because that starts covering the semantics of what's happening in these columns. Now, to liken this to an example that Power BI does, when you're in Power Query and you see the table statistics at the top, when you open like Power Query and the column statistics, that's what it's doing. It's basically collecting statistics information there, keeping that, and then showing you that over time. So like every time you load, I want to be able to observe the column statistics and then say, there are rules that I want to apply in a very simple way. Again, going back to like this rules engine or how to test the data, you're building all that homegrown. Like there's parts of the tool that show you the data, but you don't actually get to build quality checks on top of the data. And that's like you building a custom notebook, you're building another data flow to test the data and make sure it's right. And then if that passes, then you can say, okay, the data quality is good. So I think when we talk about data contracts, there's parts of this that are, schema seems very well defined to me. Like when you build a semantic model, when you build a table in Lakehouse, that's very well defined. So again, thinking about these data contracts, I think it's important to talk about this topic with people. I think you should spend a good amount of time working on the semantics of the data and what does that mean. The business probably doesn't know what the semantics should look like, and the business or data engineering team should really have a conversation around what does this mean. And I think over time you'll get better at understanding how to define the semantics, and those should definitely be documented and placed somewhere. It just doesn't feel like the tool today supports this.
No, I completely agree. And especially when you're dealing with the only really kind of approach you would have if you were Fabric is a custom notebook, right? Yeah. But again, you still have to write all the code. It's not a tool that,
and that's great expectations. It kind of helps you out a little bit. It gives you a way to write a rule and then say, make a data frame and run this rule against the data frame.
But it's not really intended for a semantic model. And again, that's kind of more or less, that's kind of the meat and the bones of what we're doing.
Well, I mean, the semantic model is just an output, right? I mean, so the semantic model is just the output of whatever the tables are being produced as, right? So if you're doing pure Power BI, you're building the semantic model, and like you could have tables in your Power Query that refer to those and do the data quality test inside the semantic model, right? Or if you're building it in Fabric, you could just have a Python notebook that does that for you as well.
That's true. Yeah, but it's still, again, it's just very custom. And again, if you're trying to repeat this for, every Lakehouse, every table, that's compared to something like Databricks where there's kind of like already something kind of built in.
Right. You just turn it on and it kind of like
right.
Yeah, I'm with you. The table statistics is something that it would be interesting to see if Fabric could produce something like that. Right. That to me, that feels a bit more like a missing feature, and maybe no one's asking for it yet. But why wouldn't table monitoring or statistics on a table just become part of the OneLake catalog? Right? Wouldn't you be like? There should be like, I feel like in OneLake catalog there should be like a health score, right?
Yeah.
You go to the OneLake catalog. Here's the table of data. I'm going to specify a couple rules. I'm going to assert some things of this table. This table must have this, and this about this number. This column's a number. This column can't have nulls. Like if you give me a couple of those things and then just generally collect statistics of the table, then you can watch the table, and what you're trying to identify data drift. Right? The data will change over time. What does the drift of that data look like over time in that table?
So I'm gonna propose something, and you could tell me how out of line this is. But
very,
I think when we're dealing with people, the interaction in someone's relationship with Power BI or Microsoft Fabric, yes, all those things are definitely important. But I think, and something that would even be, I think, more approachable from Microsoft to integrate, what are people really caring about at the end of the day? It's their metrics, right? And it's really just those things that define them, right? So like these sales teams are in these regions. The 5 allowed values. Our metrics are always updated, and they should be right, more or less. If you just took that subset, obviously a lot of that's going to be
Okay.
defined by the engineering side, but if you think about it, we already have metric sets, and metric sets already has a lot of customability. I feel like it would be easier for Microsoft to kind of have
Mm.
an input or user input field for kind of just some parameters around metrics, like what's the maximum value allowed, the lowest level allowed. Show me the change over time on some of my metrics. Hey, this column should have 5 distinct values, right? And that's part of this metric set, because rather than trying to boil the ocean with all those, and again, not saying it's not important, but all the things in the semantics, right? In terms of last refresh, processing errors. I don't think that's going to be the Microsoft, space and the interface for it. But more or less the output of those things, like again, what are the values currently in our sales team or sales regions? What are the current metrics? And having that as a hub where because if it's going to be something that Microsoft is going to build or something readily available, there has to be some global parameters, right? Rather than everything being so custom.
Global
So
parameters.
like maximum low value kind of thing. Like, hey, if any metric you could input, like, hey, what's the maximum allowed? How much has it changed per day?
I don't agree with that at all. There's no
All right.
global. There's no global anything.
Hold on. I'm not saying. I'm saying if we're going to have a nice user interface, I would call them basic parameters, basic things that could apply to
No.
any measure.
You're describing a rule engine. You need an easy way to make the rules that's simple to use. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not global. You're talking global parameters. I think I'm interpreting yours as like that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
Yeah.
we need an easier way. Like there's no easy way to apply data quality principles to tables that exist today. Right? Like and that's to me, that's the semantics of these models. There is a little bit of semantics that are applied, right? If you have a dimension table that has duplicate records and you have a one-to-many relationship to a fact table, well, if the dimension table has dupes, it automatically throws out it's not a true error, right? It's going to fail. So you can go just determine what that is and you're like, oh yes, I know what that problem is. But that's just kind of part of the limitations that the semantic model has. I don't think you want to start refreshing your semantic model and then find out you have dupes in your dim table. I think you want to find out that a little earlier in the process, right? So if you're pure Power BI, you kind of have to let the semantic model be the determination of these things.
Okay.
But if you're in Fabric, you should be testing these things earlier in the process. Okay, I think I'm on the same page as you. I think you were describing what I'm saying.
Different name. Yeah.
You were saying global, and I'm like, I'm not going to put one rule across everything.
Yeah.
However,
I just want a nice interface Microsoft creates for me that I can input value, input the numbers.
I wonder if this is something that the community will eventually develop, where we can have like data monitoring on tables. Like, I mean, why wouldn't that be just something that people would just build and have part of like a solution that users could use inside their data quality for certified data sets? Define rules of the data and it just runs them against the data set itself. Ooh. Right? I mean, it doesn't have to be a notebook, but I mean, what about a more like this feels like something that could be useful. And I like your point, Tommy, around the metric sets. Metric sets kind of make sense to put it there. But ultimately, I think when you're trying to build data discovery for people, you want the data discovery to occur like in the OneLake catalog. So I feel like you may be building these rules at other places, but you want to surface the information in OneLake catalog.
I got you. Yeah.
See what I'm saying? Like there should be I feel like every table needs a health score. And this is maybe where AI could take over. Could AI generate these rules and say, hey, based on the usage pattern of this table, here's the columns that are most frequently used. And we would recommend on these most frequently used columns in these tables, here's some recommended requirements, business expectations you should apply. Do you want me to apply them? Yes, I'll track them. Okay, great. Because you shouldn't, there's a lot of things you just don't care to track. You don't want to make extra tracking just for the sake of doing it.
Those AI functions you mean?
Maybe some AI functions could. This is interesting. Like I'm trying to unpack like what this means now a little bit. Interesting. Okay. Anyways, all this being said, I think this is really good. Let me give you some of my final thoughts. I think this article from Atlan was really good. It really helps solidify different key aspects of what I think are a data contract. A data contract is a schema. It sounds like there's semantics or business logic that's applied in the contract. The service level agreement, how often the data set's available and who's responsible for making sure it loads, what happens when it fails to load. And then the last one is like data governance. Who can see what of the data set? I think these are really good aspects. When I talk data contracts, this really helps me round out the conversation around we should be talking about these buckets of things with stakeholders of tables and figuring out what they need from let's talk data contract. Let's talk about these 4 areas. Tell me what you mean by these things. I think if you have at least introducing those topics, people will be able to give you a better definition of like, this is what I expect the data to look like. Any final thoughts, Tommy?
No, I think this is something that just needs to be brought up more. And I'm really personally in the future, really interested to see how this is going to really integrate with business users in the Fabric platform and in the workspace, rather than being at the mercy of a semantic model that's already been built, where they can actually, hopefully too, also have a part of ownership, not just saying what's wrong or what's right, but being able to go into Fabric too. And I think that's part of Microsoft's kind of overall goal, but man, is that going to help. But
there's different users that you can identify, right? There's like consumers, there's like, advanced users, and there's like expert users, right? Consumers would be I just give you a semantic model and you're done. Here's your app, you're done, right? Basic or advanced users would be like, okay, here's some shortcuts in a lakehouse. Here's a SQL endpoint inside Fabric. You can go use that. And maybe advanced users can go all the way back to the source data. Like, hey, advanced users, you're not just getting gold data, you're getting like silver level data access. But in order for you to promote your content out to consumers, we have to have a process to do that. So good thoughts. I think there's probably more topics around this one as well. Like this article, thought this was relevant for data contracts. Some things to unpack. I'd highly recommend the read through and see how you could use it in your organization. That being said, we really appreciate your ears. We know you have lots of things to do, and you could be spending your time doing a million other things. We hope this episode was slightly entertaining and or thought-provoking for you. If you liked it, please share it with somebody else. Let someone else know that you thought this topic was interesting to you, and you may use it in the future. With that being said, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever your podcast. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. Share with a friend since we do this for free. Do you have a question, idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. And finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of Power BI Tips social media channels.
Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.